Welcome to the Alphagenix Podcast, where every week we speak to incredible guests from the world of health, well-being, longevity, and of course, men's health. And I'm delighted to introduce Ryan Parke today, the men's health coach. Ryan, we've had an incredible conversation a couple of months ago now, and you delved into the science of men's mental health. But how did you get started?
Oh, I love that. Thank you, Ross. It's great to be here. And the way that I got started was back in June 2019, I bumped into a lady who I hadn't seen in years. And I was really excited to hear the latest about her son, because Jenny's son, Brad, was taller than me, more muscular. Some would say slightly better looking, although I disagree on that point. But the important thing to know is that Brad had a fast car, big house, and a great job. Plus, he was a dad with a loving wife. And I wanted to know how he was. Because I like to think I was on the same trajectory as Brad, but I was just a couple of years behind because of the age difference. Then I saw the look on his mum's face and she said, "Oh my God, Ryan, you're asking me how Brad is. You should know Brad's killed himself." And
Wow.
I was really taken aback by that for a couple of reasons, mainly because of the beliefs that I had at the time. Belief number one is I had always thought that when men are successful, they will be happy. And Brad was the most successful man that I knew, definitely the most successful guy who grew up in my road, like hands down. And then the other belief that I had at the time is that the reason why men have worse mental health outcomes than women, I'd always heard what we all hear, is it's because we just don't talk.
Yeah.
And yet Brad was the most articulate man I knew. I found out after his death that 2 years before he died, he went to the doctors and said, "Help, I think I'm depressed." He took the antidepressants that he was prescribed. He went to the therapy he was referred to. It was 2 different kinds of therapy. And 2 months before his death, his mum said to him, "Brad, call me every night. Tell me how you feel. It will make you feel better." Now, I'm not saying these things didn't help, Ross. I'm sure that they did help. But the thing that really struck me at the time was that Brad did all the things that we tell men to do when they're in trouble. And yet he still wasn't here. And Brad's mum, Jenny, said to me, "Ryan, you should learn about this," because she actually lectures in mental health at a university. And she said, "You should learn about this, Ryan, because every 5 hours, 4 people die from suicide in the UK and Ireland. 3 of them are men."
Wow.
And I took what Jenny said really seriously. I decided there and then I was going to spend one day every week from June 2019 to the end of the year learning everything that I possibly could about men's mental health. And I'm no saint, Ross. I didn't do this for anyone else. I did this because I knew that Brad wouldn't want what happened to him to happen to me.
Yeah.
And then go on.
I was just going to say, like, what a catalyst, I guess, Lynn, to have that happen, where you're there 1 minute inquiring about this guy that you've known and kind of held on a bit of a pedestal, and then all of a sudden to learn that must have been a hell of a shock.
It literally turned my world upside down, because I just had this preconception of how things worked and what I was working towards and what all men were working towards in my mind. So to see that when you actually get there, that might not be a solution, a positive place to be, was really, really scary, Ross.
Yeah, absolutely. And then that led you on to your research. So you were busy day a week, head in the books and in the computer. What did you learn?
So the very first day that I looked into this, at the time I had no background in mental health, no medical background whatsoever. So I didn't know where to start. And I decided a logical place to start would be learning about life expectancy in men. And the very first day that I'm learning about life expectancy in men, I was reading a study that just mentioned there's 1 day every year where a man's chances of having a heart attack jump up by 30%. So this is a heart attack, not suicide. A man's chances on this day of having a heart attack jump up by 30%. But on the same day, women's chances of having a heart attack go down significantly. Can you guess what day that is?
I would have said no, but after we've already talked about this, I don't know the answer. So it was when the clocks change, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And
that's not what I said. And that's not what I said the first time, by the way, for anyone listening.
yeah, and everyone always guesses Valentine's Day, New Year's Day, birthdays, that kind of thing. And you don't have to feel bad if you didn't know this, because I've even asked heart surgeons who don't know this question.
Mm-hmm.
So when the clocks jump forward 1 hour, all the men that you know are 30% more likely to have a heart attack the next day on the Monday. And on the same day, women's chance of having a heart attack goes down. And when I read that, Ross, I had to know what causes that.
Yeah.
And it turns out the way that it works inside your body is if you miss 1 hour's sleep, what happens to your body depends upon whether you're male or female. In a man's body, missing 1 hour's sleep temporarily lowers his testosterone significantly. And in a man's body, as testosterone goes down, his chances of having a heart attack go up.
Yeah.
And when I learned that, I thought, that's really interesting, because I was born in 1990, so I was 29 at the time. And I remember thinking my whole life, I had never heard anything positive about testosterone. In fact, when I was a kid and there was a fight in my local pub, I remember hearing my mum's friends saying, of course, they ended up fighting. They had too much testosterone.
Yeah.
So I thought, how can a hormone that causes fights in men also protect men from having a heart attack? That doesn't make sense to me. So the following week, I'm going to learn everything I can about testosterone. Well, I learned as much as you can in a 12-hour obsessive day. But what really jumped out at me, the first thing I wanted to know is, why does testosterone make men aggressive? And it turns out it doesn't. That was disproved a very long time ago. Just the PR hasn't caught up yet, unfortunately.
There's so much misinformation about it. I mean, even last week, there was something in the press talking about RFK over in America running for president. And they were saying he was taking steroids, and he was potentially going to give himself a heart attack or cause cancer. And this piece was really negative. And actually, it was just a gentleman in his 60s prioritizing his health. And as we know, optimizing testosterone is cardioprotective. It doesn't cause cancer. In fact, as your testosterone goes down, you're more likely to get prostate growth. So even today, you see this awful misinformation regarding testosterone. But I jumped in. Sorry, please carry on.
No, it's all good, because what you're talking about, that was what I found out later on that day as well. So when I wanted to find out, why does testosterone protect a man's heart? And it turns out not only does it protect his heart, but obviously it protects his mental health as well. You and lots of your listeners are going to be familiar with this. And I thought, that's really interesting, because the biggest killer of men at the time in the UK and Ireland back in 2019, from the age of 18 to 45, was suicide. Suicide is linked to depression, and depression in men, as you know, is linked to low testosterone.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, some studies have found that the average depressed man has about 30% less free circulating testosterone than the average man who's not depressed. And then the biggest killer of men at the time, from 45 to 60, was heart disease. Heart disease, heart attack, and heart failure in men are all linked to low testosterone. So I wondered, what's the biggest killer of men after the age of 60? The biggest killer of men after the age of 60, and the biggest killer of men of all, is cancer. The most likely cancer you're going to get is prostate cancer. And what's the single biggest indicator you'll develop prostate cancer? Low testosterone.
Yeah.
And
which is the opposite of what we used to think.
Exactly. It's the absolute opposite. And so I started to realize that actually, after just a couple of days of trying to understand men's mental health, I was starting to realize that actually, not only is testosterone completely vital for our mental health, our physical health, and our life expectancy, but we're not told about it. And worse, there's actually stigma associated with testosterone that's completely unjust, unscientific,
Mm-hmm.
and it's a load of nonsense, basically. Well, The key thing is, although I talk about testosterone a lot, this isn't actually a conversation about testosterone. It was just the first thing that I started learning about that I found fascinating, that started to change my perception of how the world worked. And I carried on researching in this way, Ross, which was, let's assume I know nothing, because I did know nothing at the time. It was a pretty safe bet. And I just kept asking big questions that I didn't know the answers to. And I just kept reading scientific papers, reading articles, and really just connecting the dots. And at the end of that 6 months of study, I got to the stage where I wasn't learning anything new. Everything kept coming back to this belief I had at that point that there's 5 dimensions to male mental health. And I decided to start balancing them in my own life.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to talk about what they are during this podcast. But what's really interesting is this isn't necessarily a story about me, but by balancing those 5, I call them 5 dimensions, my life changed and I quickly became much happier and much healthier. And knowing what you do about hormones, like, you can understand how that would happen, right?
Yeah.
And then in early 2020, I started to have guys approach me to say, Ryan, I know that I used to do a lot of sales coaching. Would you instead coach me on what you're doing with your life? And I initially was a bit scared, but I thought, well, how can it hurt to just share some facts with people? One of the first guys that I worked with, he was badly depressed. He was having thoughts about suicide every single day. And he hadn't been paid to work in 2 years. He was a brilliant actor, not been paid to work in 2 years. And I remember sitting down with him and I realized quite quickly, like, which areas of this balance were out of whack in his life. Well,
Mm-hmm.
we agreed to work together. Day 2, he calls me for the first time and says he's no longer having thoughts about suicide.
Wow.
Day 10, he calls me and says, I realized today I'm not depressed anymore. And at the end of the 12 weeks that we worked together, not only had he stopped having thoughts about suicide, not only had he stopped feeling depressed, but he'd gone from not having had any work in 2 years to landing 2 jobs with Netflix and 1 job with the BBC. And he's just been one of the main characters in a series that's just aired on BBC.
Fantastic.
And I remember I just took a step back there, Ross, and I looked at what had happened to him. And I remember thinking, what the hell is going on? How can such simple information be so useful to men? So what I'd really like to do in this podcast is I want to talk through that framework with you, get your thoughts, get your feedback. I'll probably learn from you as well, because, especially when it comes to testosterone, you'll know as much or more than me. So it would be really great to thrash these things out together.
Yeah, well, love it. And I'm sure everyone listening is thinking, what are these 5 dimensions? So let's dive into it.
Let's do it. So back when this was a framework that I was using just for myself, I knew that I needed an acronym so I could remember these 5 things. It had to be memorable and it had to be manly. I couldn't call it like the puppy framework or something like that. It had to have some bite. And obviously there's certain words that sound manly. You'll be familiar with this one, right? What I landed in at the end was a phrase that I believe we need to reimagine, and eventually this became the Alpha framework, funnily enough.
Love it.
And so what I want to do is talk you through the Alpha framework. The first A in Alpha stands for achieving recognition. Right, now, what does that mean? Well, for most of human history, only a tiny number of men who lived ever had any children. In fact, we know from gene studies that if you wind back the clocks about 8,000 years, for every 17 women that became a mum, just 1 man became a dad.
Wow.
So he was a busy boy, right?
Yeah.
And that's the world that we come from, this world of intense competition between men. And our bodies are highly sensitive to this competition. And in fact, what loads of studies have found is that in human men, only in men and in the majority of men, as our social status increases, so does the level of serotonin in our brain. Now, this is really interesting because serotonin is a bit of a buzzword at the moment. It is a hormone. It's also used as a communicator in your brain. And when it's in your brain, what it does is it promotes feelings of happiness, feeling connected, and it's also been linked to an ability to act in accordance with your goals. Conversely, low levels of serotonin in a person's brain have been linked to anxiety, to thoughts about suicide, and an inability to be able to act in accordance with your goals. So we have this really vicious or virtuous cycle in men. The problem is, if you are not achieving recognition, if you're not where you want to be in life, you may have this low level of serotonin. And the end result is you can't act in accordance with your goals, which means you can't get to where you want to be in life. So you need a method to jumpstart your serotonin system and get it going again.
Yeah, it's like a vicious cycle.
Absolutely. And this is really typical of men's mental health. Men's mental health is full of vicious cycles. In fact, every one of these dimensions can turn into a vicious cycle if you don't know the signs and you don't know how to snap out of it.
Mm-hmm.
But then there's a flip side to this as well, which is, yes, it's important to be able to achieve recognition. But what you can't do is you can't focus everything on achieving recognition. There's a problem with that as well, which is for our ancestors, nothing was more important than passing on their genes. The only way they could pass on their genes would be to achieve the recognition of their tribe.
Mm-hmm.
If you're alive today, you are the child of a long line of winners, because only the men who could achieve the recognition of their tribe would pass on their genes. Therefore, your genes come from the men who achieved recognition. So it's programmed into you to do the same. And this is so powerful in men that studies by the Austrian army found that getting promoted one rank increased a man's serotonin levels in his brain by 25%.
Wow.
So like, that's just a transformational amount when it comes to like hormones and neurotransmitters. If you have 25% difference between two creatures, something big is going on there, right?
100%, yeah.
So we have this downside, which is if you're not achieving recognition, you need a way to jumpstart your serotonin system. So like what I did with that actor that I told you about is his goals were so big, he was getting massive procrastination about them. And so we took it down to the smallest possible level. In fact, the very, very first day, his daily goal was to make himself a cup of tea. And then he makes his cup of tea. He feels happy that he's done that. One of the effects of doing that is he's now going to feel comfortable going for bigger goals and his body's going to give him a boost. One of the things it's going to boost is serotonin, but we'll talk about some other things that will boost shortly.
Yeah, love that. Yeah, so make a cup of tea, write a page on your CV, send that to 3 promoters or whatever, just little bite-sized goals and kind of move up.
Absolutely. And as small as you can possibly make them. So when I work with guys who are saying they want to get in shape or something, and if their first goal is to run a 10K, it's like, no, we can't do that. For numerous different reasons. Your first goal must be get on your running shoes and get outdoors.
Yeah.
And even keep that goal every day. So, you want to have really, really low achievable goals. But then there's a flip side as well, Ross, which is let's say I am a man like Brad, in that I really am good at achieving recognition. I've got the status, I've got the car, I've got the job, I've got the salary. In fact, anything that men can measure can become a source of achieving recognition.
Mm-hmm.
So if there's a number in it, if there's a belt or a rank you can achieve, that is a method of achieving recognition. The problem is that the reward for us is so powerful that often we get completely fixated on achieving recognition and we completely neglect 4 other vital areas of the Alpha framework, these other 4 dimensions. Yeah. So when I work with guys who are in that situation, some really good news is that there's a lot of wisdom around at the moment that people will say that, if you change your thoughts, it will change your world and it will change your actions. But actually, I disagree with that. The evidence that we have on how our brain works through things like neuroplasticity and other mechanisms in our brain as well is actually, if you change your actions, that changes your thoughts. You know, and often when people would say to me, wow, I had this really life-changing decision, you can always track it back to an action or something that happened to them that caused that new thought to arise.
Yeah.
Because
Having to push beyond their comfort zone, something like that, and
yes,
take a different action.
yeah, exactly. Because thinking is a chemical process. And when you change your actions, you change the chemicals that are available in that process. You end up with more serotonin, more positive thoughts. So that's the first A in Alpha, it's achieving recognition. And it's about, yes, it's about competing, but it's about making progress in your life. It's about being as close as you can to the man that you want to be and achieving that social status. And it's okay to do that, even though you're doing it in some ways for other people. But you have to bear in mind, it's just one of 5 things you need to balance.
Yeah.
Are you with me so far?
Yeah, because I guess otherwise, and to go back to your story about Brad would have been great because he would have 25% more serotonin than anybody else. He was a high performer. So if it was just as simple as that, then he would have been more protected, I guess.
Absolutely, yeah. And so you can see how it all started to fit together actually at this stage. I was like, wow, there's a lot more to men's mental health than I ever thought.
Yeah, absolutely. So what's number 2?
So then the L in Alpha is looking after body and mind. And of course, you're the expert in this, which is why it's brilliant to be here. But of course, I'd realized early on that all the biggest killers of men were in some ways linked to low levels of testosterone.
Yeah.
And so when I learned that, I had to know what are the key ingredients for a healthy level of testosterone. How can you optimize your life? And I want to tell you what I think are the key ingredients from the research I've done to optimize testosterone, but also, you know, throw at me if there's anything I've missed. If you think I should change the message, that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I came to the conclusion that there's 4 main things. The first single most important factor is sleep. Specifically, as close as you can to 8 hours sleep every night, because that is the length of time, if you're generating your own testosterone, that's the length of time your body really needs to get that out. And there's some studies, one in particular, that actually found that missing 1 hour's sleep temporarily lowers a man's testosterone by the equivalent of around 12 years of aging.
Wow.
Now, yeah, it's only temporary. So, you know, if you start getting sleep again, you won't catch up as such. That's not how sleep works, but you will begin to repair that. And so the single biggest factor that I found was sleep. And here's something really mad, Ross. When sometimes if you're scrolling on social media, there's a lot of information out there at the moment, which is all about napping during the day.
Yes.
And lots of people are saying it's so brilliant for you. But the thing that we need to know as men is it's not good for men. In fact, it's been found that napping during the day is actually an indicator of shorter life expectancy in men. And so what's really important is, you know, if you're male and you're tired today, you get to sunset before you start sleeping. And it completely contradicts everything you read on Facebook and social media, which is like, oh, take a nap. The benefits are proven for women.
Yeah.
And for men, we need that 8 hours. So that's the first thing that I found was the sleep. Then the second thing, it kind of ties the third, but is exercise. It's really important to be active. The sedentary lifestyle, sitting at your desk all day like this, going home, sitting at your desk to catch up with emails, and then sitting to watch Netflix. That's really bad for us men. It's bad for everyone, but it's terrible for men. You've got to, like you were in Armenia recently, you know, you've got to get out there and you've got to physically do things.
Yeah.
And don't stack your exercise for 1 day of the week. The best thing to do is to spread it out. So you're getting 30 plus minutes of exercise every day. That's better than doing 3 hours on Sunday and no exercise throughout the week.
Yeah.
Then the next thing that I found in sort of order of significance is diet. Massively, massively important.
Yeah.
Specifically, homemade food. So studies have found that actually analyzing diet in men, the men who have the healthiest level of natural testosterone tends to eat the most homemade food. And that's because when you eat out, even in a restaurant, even a sit-down meal in a restaurant or fast food or takeaway, loads of it's processed. And one of the processes that happens to that food is sugar is added to it. And when your body's creating insulin to deal with the sugar, to put it into your cells, it stops making testosterone. And so that's a really important thing, is you want to be eating, you want to avoid sugars, avoid carbs, but definitely avoid sugars. I can't stress that enough. And you want to be getting lots of like dark greens, meat in there and other things that we'll talk about as well. But it's got to be like whole foods that are being made in your kitchen. And then there's a fourth thing as well. And the fourth thing, which is really, really important, is vitamin D, which comes from our main source is the sun. And actually, when I saw that list of things, Ross, I remember thinking, oh, crap. Because, I knew Brad, who I was talking about earlier. I knew Brad, and I knew that, yes, he did everything we tell men to do. He went to the doctors, he took antidepressants, he went to counseling, he called his mum every night. But you know what? No one knew enough about men's mental health to realize that Brad was focusing everything he had on achieving recognition. And I knew him, and I know that actually the sleep, getting 8 hours sleep a night, getting enough exercise, homemade food, and getting out in the sun, they just weren't anywhere on his list of priorities. And I knew at the time they weren't on my list either. And so I came to realize that actually trying to be a man is something that kills a lot of men.
100%. And the things you've just pointed out there are the things that we talk about a lot as well, because testosterone replacement therapy isn't magic. If someone has very low testosterone, they can't sit on the sofa and eat pizza and expect to feel and look great. You have to be making optimal lifestyle choices, and optimal sleep, super important. If we go deeper into what you've said, what you really were saying is testosterone is produced in the testes via the Leydig cells when we're asleep. That's why you need quality sleep. Why then do we need to exercise? Well, when we exercise, particularly when we exercise to fatigue, testosterone is naturally produced. And as we've become more sedentary over the last 100 years, testosterone has halved, unsurprisingly, because we're not as active. The nutrition that goes into our body is the building blocks to many of these things, including our hormones, with the nutrients that we put in. So super important. And whether we're keto, carnivore, plant-based, fundamentally what those things are unprocessed natural food, which again goes back to what you've just said there. Avoid the sugars, put in the basic building blocks, and you can't go too far wrong. Vitamin D is really interesting as well. As you know, it's a steroid. We think about it as a vitamin. What is a vitamin? It's a steroid, same as cholesterol, same as your testosterone. So actually getting out into the sun is incredibly important, and if necessary, supplementing it as well. And that's a big thing we talk about. Sometimes you need that little bit extra, whether it's with a vitamin D supplement, whether it's zinc, magnesium, or whether it's someone who needs TRT. So yeah, love that, and put it all together, and it creates optimal mental health as well as optimal physical health, which is what you're talking about. So I love it.
And that's a connection that's really missed at the moment, because if you look at, there's loads of studies around that are finding, this is really interesting, men who are depressed are much more likely to have a heart attack. Men who have heart disease are much more likely to be depressed. Well, the problem is at the moment, we have two different professions, one studying mental health and one studying physical health. But if you take a holistic approach to health, they are both conditions of very, very low testosterone.
Mm-hmm.
And so actually, we're almost looking at one single condition, but from two different professions' point of views. They're both symptoms of low levels of testosterone. And they, the first thing to try in that is to reboot your lifestyle. Make sure that, as you said, you're getting those key ingredients. And zinc and magnesium are really lovely ones, because I sometimes hear people say that they're key ingredients for testosterone, and actually they're bodyguards for testosterone. Magnesium prevents things from binding to testosterone so it can still be used, and zinc beats the enzyme that breaks testosterone down into estrogen. And so if you're also getting that zinc and magnesium in your diet, whether it's through spinach or oysters, or whether it's supplementation, then your testosterone has these bodyguards going around with it in your blood, which are bouncing the things off that would actually break down testosterone.
Yeah, it was described by one of our guests a little while ago as like an orchestra. So, when all of the aspects of our body are working well, it's like a symphony going from this orchestra. But when just one of those things is out of balance, then it just doesn't sound right.
Oh, that was lovely, because you'd really notice in an orchestra if you had a rogue trombone, wouldn't you?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly right.
Fantastic. And so the L in Alpha is looking after body and mind. Look, you and your listeners would be familiar with the symptoms of a low level of testosterone, whether it's poor sleep, whether it's low mood, whether it's much more serious concerns like depression. But they would be the key signs that when I'm working with a guy, that's what I'd be looking for.
Yeah, love that. So what's next?
So the P in Alpha stands for protecting the cave. And this is an interesting one for a couple of reasons. So back at the very beginning of learning about this, I was reading a study, and it just so happened to mention that men who have problem debt are 3 times more likely to die by suicide than men who do not have problem debt. And this is a continuous theme when it comes to men's mental health, and especially suicide in men as well. So in the same way that achieving recognition is associated with serotonin, looking after body and mind is associated with testosterone, protecting the cave is associated with security. And men have a specific need when it comes to security, which is we need to provide it. We need to know that we are a positive, protecting force to those that we care about. And there's an amazing intervention that demonstrates this, which happened just before lockdown. Rates of men's suicide in Bristol were so high that the local authorities there actually held up their hands and said, we don't know what to do about this. There was some extra funding set aside, and an organization called Second Step intervened. I could say stepped in, but that'd be a bit cheesy. But Second Step intervened. And what they said is, okay, give us a cohort of men who are depressed and having thoughts about suicide and might be struggling financially. They took that cohort of men, and they didn't give them traditional talking therapy, which is very, emotional led and investigating the past. They didn't do that. What they did is they provided 2 kinds of support. Number 1 was a series of problem-solving, solution-focused conversations. So this is as practical as you can get. What's the problem? What are you going to do about the problem? Why haven't you done that yet? That kind of thing. And the next thing that they did is they provided financial skills training. And that program came to be known as the HOPE program in Bristol. And 6 months after the end of the HOPE program, the number of men in the cohort who were still having thoughts about suicide had halved. And when I read that, I remember thinking, that's a big typo, because I read a lot and I do a lot of research about interventions for men who are having thoughts about suicide. And I had never seen an intervention that prevented half the men from having thoughts about suicide. Never seen anything like that. So I thought it was a typo, read the whole study. It's not a typo. It's just the most successful intervention I've ever read about for men who are having thoughts about suicide. And it's nothing to do with expressing your emotions. It's nothing to do with what we hear so much about. It's literally, you want to protect your cave. These are some tools to help you do it. And there are some really specific warning signs when it comes to protecting the cave that we should be aware about in case we feel these things, or in case a man that we care about is talking about these things. And none of these 3 warning signs are warning signs to mental health practitioners. And this is part of the problem. But the 3 warning signs is, number 1 is talk about overwhelm. And overwhelm is a failure of the prioritization function in your brain. And for men, that's really bad, because it means we don't feel able to protect our cave. That's the sign that we might not be doing it at the moment. And then when it gets slightly worse, then you start to have feelings of shame. And they will progress eventually, if you don't address it, to a feeling of being a burden. And the reason why this is really important, Ross, is because everything that I've learned and everything I've seen from interviews with families who lost a man And from working with men who I've seen transform their lives in the 12 weeks we worked together, everything I've learned basically points to the fact that in men, we are so driven to protect our cave that if we feel like a burden, our final act will be to protect our cave by getting rid of that burden. It's something that we do for other people. And it seems to be quite inbuilt in men, which is why it's a problem that this aspect of financial health is not being properly looked at and supported when men reach out for help with their mental health.
Wow, that's again quite incredible. And when you break it down like that, it makes a lot of sense as well, because you do hear that I just don't want to be a burden anymore. You know, that's something I'm sure we've all heard for justification why people take their own life.
And there's other aspects as well. Like I was one of the first programs that I delivered last year was for my local police force. It was a series of talks, workshops, conversations. And afterwards, there were these police officers, Ross, grabbing hold of me saying, can I just say this makes so much sense? Because there's this phenomena in the police, which is that when you, the most successful officers, male officers, when they retire, some of them take their own lives. And it doesn't make any sense because like retirement is what you're waiting for. But actually, you've been achieving recognition. You've been protecting your cave and now you're retired. And actually, maybe you don't have that function anymore. And maybe you start to feel like you're a burden and it's natural to want to get rid of that burden. So they're the warning signs.
Yeah.
It
I guess
also,
in the police as well, sorry, just to add in, you have to maintain a level of fitness in order to perform your duty. So I guess even looking after your body and mind as well comes into that retirement where you don't need to, so it lapses.
There are some catastrophic moments in a man's life where you have to consciously refocus all these 5 dimensions. And it's weird to say, but retirement is one of those catastrophic moments, which is you might have been provided for by your job for all these 5 things. And then actually, suddenly now you don't have any of them. Your time is your own, but what you do next is a big question mark for men sometimes.
Yeah, 100%. And I mean, I'm a physio by profession, and we're very used to having patients coming in and after they retired, their health deteriorated because we don't have that thing that's pulling us in the right direction, creating a positive spiral of events.
And then there's another element to protecting the cave as well, which is what I refer to as intimate partner relationships. And there's a lot of evidence that intimate partner relationships, that's your relationship with your closest, your nearest and dearest. You know, this is your wife, your girlfriend, your boyfriend, I don't care. But your relationship with the closest person in your life, it's actually really important to men. In fact, it's more important to men than to women. And that sounds weird, but men who are recently separated are 7 times more likely to die from suicide than men who are in a relationship. 7 times. Conversely, when women get out of a relationship, they become less likely to die by suicide and overall tend to have higher happiness figures when they're involved in surveys and things. So for women, getting out of a relationship is like this liberating moment. Don't tell my fiance, Emma. But for us men, a relationship ending can be another one of these really critical points because it's something like you had this cave and all these people to protect. And now they've left and the cave is empty. That's a vulnerable moment in a man's life.
Presumably the ladies, the women that are happier are only if the relationship was bad.
Potentially, but like the general information is that actually just getting out of a relationship is quite a liberating experience for a woman.
Wow. I'm not going to tell my wife that.
Yeah, let's not tell anyone that. There's just us guys. And then there's a real problem here, which is the problem is caused by another hormone, which I want to talk about. Let's say we're in a heterosexual relationship. So a relationship like me and Emma, you know, obviously I'm male, Emma's female, right? The problem comes from the hormone oxytocin. So oxytocin is released when we talk, touch, cuddle, hold hands, have sex. It's often referred to as the bonding hormone and the love hormone. It's quite incorrect. It's really nothing to do with love in men, but let's let people think that. But anyway, so oxytocin is this bonding hormone that makes you feel close to people. Oxytocin in women reduces stress, cortisol significantly. That means that if you're female, touching, talking, cuddling, talking about your day reduces your stress. But oxytocin does not reduce stress for men. This means that touching, talking, cuddling, talking about your day, sharing your problems on its own does not reduce stress for men.
Ah.
And so there's this very interesting challenge that men get into a lot, which is, let's say I'm feeling down. And I reach out and I would tell someone and they say, oh, Ryan, you're feeling down because, men don't talk. You've just got to talk more. So I start talking more. I start sharing more of what's going on in my life. And maybe I'm talking to a friend. Maybe I'm going to see a therapist. And if that doesn't make me feel better, I will still be continually told, you've just got to talk more. And the end result is I will come to a logical but dangerous conclusion that there must be something wrong with me. And so lots of the men that I've worked with in the past, if they were depressed, they're now in this situation of feeling isolated because they think that talking works for everyone but them. And it's actually a big relief for them to hear that, no, that's not what the science says. The science says that talking alone for men is not a solution. It's a way that we share information and learn about solutions. It's absolutely vital, but it's not sufficient in the same way that it is for women. When Emma has a bad day at work, she comes home, takes her coat off, and telling me about it and having a cuddle solves the problem. She's happy again.
Yeah.
But I don't know about you, Ross, but like if I have a bad day, there's no amount of cuddling I can do that will make me feel better. Right? I need to fix my problem. I need 15 minutes to get on my laptop and solve the problems that were caused from today.
Yeah, 100%. That's definitely something that I think I've seen in myself where, I need to fix something.
Yes.
It's if something's happened, right, logically, then what do I need to do to see this through to where it's fixed? It's no longer a problem anymore, and I can not even think about it. Whereas, Joanne, my other half, she'd very much, okay, let's talk about my day. Let's go through everything. So I've definitely seen that. That's really interesting.
And so what we're aiming to get to is a point where in a heterosexual relationship, we've got this nice space where if I'm male and I don't get the benefit from talking, then I might not realize that Emma gets the benefit from just talking. So we want to get to a space where the Emma and the Joanne are just talking and feeling better, and we're listening and we're not offering solutions, even when there is a clear solution. And then we also want to get to a space where when we've had a bad day and we need 15 minutes, we need 60 minutes to solve a problem and we don't want to talk about it, that's okay.
Yeah. I wish you told me that about 10 years ago. So.
I wish I'd known it 10 years ago. And so what the science says that for men, I call it protecting the cave, but it's everything to do with problem solving, providing, protecting. It's prioritization. It's all these things that make you realize that you are a really positive influence on the people who rely on you. And that's protecting the cave.
Love that. Love it. So H, what's next?
H is having adventures. Now, this is all to do with dopamine, and I'll tell you exactly how this works. So today is Thursday. Ross, what were you doing at this time on Thursday 2 weeks ago?
This time 2 weeks ago, I was packing, ready to go off to Armenia to have an adventure. And last Thursday, I was waking up at base camp about to climb the highest mountain in Armenia, and I'm still a bit sunburned.
I love this. So this is a really, really nice example, right? When I asked the question what you were doing, you knew where you were 2 weeks ago at this time and 1 week ago. And is it fair to say that's because what you were doing was significant?
And exciting. Yeah.
Exciting, right? Conversely, if you'd been sitting in your home office doing paperwork 2 weeks ago, would you have known what you were doing?
No.
And actually, there's nothing wrong with you. It's just the way our brain works. So what happens is your brain, everyone's brain, uses a lot of energy, more than other organs. And lots of your brain's energy that it uses is to do with the process of memory creation. So when you're doing something that you know how to do, what your brain will do in order to save energy is switch into autopilot. And in autopilot, your brain doesn't write memories. So what happens is as we get older and we become more competent, We spend more time in autopilot. And the end result is, as we get older, life gets faster and faster and faster.
Yeah.
And so conversely, if you want to slow that process down, if you want to feel more connected to the moment, then what you do is, let's say your trip to Armenia, you're going to new places, you're meeting new people, you're having new experiences. Your brain will release a neurotransmitter called dopamine, which we hear a lot about at the moment. It's quite complicated, it's quite misunderstood, but it's really useful to understand. And when you have that dose of dopamine, it's associated with motivation and attention. It basically puts you in the moment. It also, in high doses, it's associated with cravings and addictions as well. It is the hormone that makes mammals interested in things outside of themselves.
Okay. Yeah.
And so that dopamine connects you to the moment, which is what you had when you're in Armenia, when you're climbing, even when you're packing.
Yeah.
Some of that dopamine gets broken down into another chemical transmitter in our brain, neurotransmitter, which you don't need to remember, but it's called noradrenaline. And noradrenaline is the trigger for memory creation.
Ah.
And this is why, do you remember when you were a kid, the summer holidays lasted 6 weeks, but it felt like 10 years?
Yeah.
And then there'll be periods in your life where you're an adult where 10 years felt like it lasted 6 weeks.
Yeah.
And this is all to do with what your brain is making, whether it's making dopamine, whether it's making noradrenaline. Conversely, if you have an experience where you're so far out of your comfort zone, you're like in a war zone or a traumatic situation, the levels of noradrenaline in your brain run so high that it writes memories so deep you can't forget them. And we call that PTSD.
Yeah. And I guess it lengthens that time as well, so it can feel even longer.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's exactly how it works. If you're in a pleasant situation, it never flies by, does it?
Yeah.
So here's a really key strategy, because lots of the men that I work with, sometimes I'll be working with guys and they'll say, Ryan, I just feel like the last 5 years has passed in 5 weeks. And I'll say, excellent. When did you last have a really long break? And guess what they say, Ross?
5 years ago.
Yeah, every time. And about a third of the men I've worked with haven't had a holiday in a couple of years.
Wow.
I worked with a guy many years ago when I was just starting out, and he was a US Marine, really cool job. And he said, Ryan, my life's getting so fast. And I said, when did this start? He said, 3 years ago. I said, can I guess you haven't had a holiday in 3 years? He went, how do you know that? And it turns out, Ross, in the Marines in America, they get 35 days annual leave a year, but they can only carry 70 forward. So if you don't take holiday for 2 years, you get your 70 and everything else gets knocked off. And it's a badge of honor to carry forward those 70 days every year. So none of them take a holiday, or at least in that guy's group, no one was taking holidays. And the end result is, when you don't have the fluctuations in dopamine in your life, you end up with low levels of motivation, low levels of focus. Life gets too fast, it flies by. And actually, these symptoms together, we now call burnout. And so conversely, you've got to go to new places, get out your comfort zone, meet new people. The adventure zone is somewhere in between the comfort zone, where you don't have any dopamine, and a war zone where you've got so much noradrenaline you might get PTSD. That's soft, that cool place in the middle where you're pushing yourself, you're out your comfort zone, but you're not in an actual war. That's the adventure zone, and that's where positive memories are written.
Love that. Brilliant.
I've also got a really amazing strategy, which some of the guys that I'm coaching are experimenting with at the moment, and it's had really positive results. One of the drains in our life, which you'll hear a lot of people speaking about now, is our smartphones. The reason is our smartphone, like cocaine, like chocolate, like sugar, like porn, is designed to spike dopamine, to fire it up. And what happens is, because we have a limited supply, the dopamine levels in our brain comes crashing back down again. It's like a tap that's attached to a slow filling tank. And if you open that tap right up, you just run out. And the end result is, looking at our phone, the way that software companies have designed it, the intense colors, the white writing on a red circular background to show notifications, is designed to spike dopamine. which of course used to bring us out the cave to forage. We are foraging on our phone.
Yeah.
But there's no reward out there. So it becomes extremely addictive. And here's an amazing hack, Ross, which is if you have to spend time on your phone every day, carry on doing that, but put the phone into grayscale mode on Apple or bedtime mode on Android. And what that does, and there's some recent studies about this that have come out, what that does is it completely bypasses all of those designs that are meant to spike your dopamine. So you're not spiking your dopamine when you look at your phone, and using your phone in grayscale mode for just 24 hours in a study that came out this year was found to reduce screen time, reduce perceived suffering, and increase life satisfaction in 24 hours.
Wow, I've just written that down. I'm definitely going to do that.
Yeah, it's really brilliant. So on Apple, you go in accessibility, and then you go after that color filters, grayscale mode. And on Android, you're going to go into wellness and parental settings, bedtime mode, activate.
Brilliant. Definitely going to do that straight afterwards. And going back what you were saying about adventures and things as well, we've used hedonic calendaring in our family for the last few years, and it's really, really useful to have those times sort of already calendared in. Gives you something to look forward to. So myself and Joanne will always go on holiday once a year without the kids, which seems to be quite polarizing. Some of our friends are like, "Oh, you do what?" And others go, "That's brilliant." But we always have that time set aside, and then once a month we'll go out at least for dinner. Once every quarter we'll go away and stay somewhere for the night, and things like that. So we've got something to look forward to, and I find that's really useful for having those adventures and things, unusual things booked in.
It's absolutely essential. And you remember that Marine that I was talking to you about?
Yeah.
So he was in a situation where no holiday up in the air, nothing booked, nothing to look forward to in a way. And he was really concerned about booking holiday because he'd be the only guy in his squad to book this holiday. And the strategy that he did in the end was he literally took his diary, handed it to his partner and said to her, "I have 70 days of holiday to take. I'd love to spend this time with you." You can guess what happened next. It was all booked in an instant, in an absolute moment, right? So problem solved. And then once you're using that holiday, all you've got to do is a bit like the booking that you're doing, with at the moment, is if you go on a 5-day break, make sure that before you return to work, you book another 5 days. And keep that rotational holiday. Make sure that you've always got, if you have 25 days a year, make sure you've got 25 days booked. There's no reason not to.
Yeah.
Stop saving it for rainy days that don't come. You want to take time off in work. And that's an area actually where I find men, we can be quite bad at this, because how can you achieve recognition if the office realizes it works without you? There's a direct conflict there.
Yeah, that makes sense. And what's the final A then? What's the fifth dimension?
This is a really good question, right? So every now and again, I'll be having like a discovery call with a man, and we'll have talked to this stage. And on discovery calls, I kind of butcher this conversation for podcasts a little bit, because there's, I do 12 plus hours of workshops on this stuff for my coaching cohort where we go deep into things. But I hope you don't mind. This conversation is designed to give your listeners a really quick burst of things that changes they can make in their life, right? And every now and again, I'll be on a discovery call with a guy, and we'll have gone through these dimensions, and he says, Ryan, there's something you should know about me. I'm great at achieving recognition. I'm a director at work. I've got share options. I've got the brand new BMW 840i CI convertible sitting on my driveway. And I'm brilliant at looking after body and mind. I always get my 8 hours sleep. I do lots and lots of exercise. I've got a great diet. I make loads of food myself. I'm doing all that. I take a couple of supplements, vitamin D free, those kind of things. I'm brilliant at protecting the cave. I'm really confident looking at my bank statements. I always spend less than I earn. I've got 3 months money in the bank. So at any point I can say to my boss, I'm done and I know I'll be fine for 3+ months. I've paid off all my high interest debt. I've got a great relationship with my partner. When she has a bad day, I just listen. I don't offer any solutions, even when there are tons of potential solutions. I just listen. And I'm great at having adventures. I spend 3 months of the year sitting in a jacuzzi in Bali, watching the stock price go up. And I go, cool, so why are we talking? And he'll always say the same thing, which is, I just feel like there's something missing. And that's because there is. The final A in Alpha stands for able to serve. And to tell you what that's about, I want to give you just an idea of the state of men's mental health in the UK and how things are changing over time. So, according to a study by the BACP, 79% of men now agree it's more acceptable to talk about mental health than it was 5 years ago. So that's good. Things are moving in the right direction. The same study found that 68% of men agree there's less stigma surrounding mental health for men than there was 5 years ago. Moving in the right direction. The study also found that men in the UK now are 50% more likely to have had therapy in the last 6 months than they were 12 years ago. So massive step in the right direction, right? 50% increase in the number of men who've had therapy in the last 12 months. That was between 2010 and 2022. However, in the same time that men have said it's much easier to talk about mental health, in the same time that men say there's less stigma, and in the same time that men have become 50% more likely to attend talking therapy, we've also become 11% more likely to die by suicide. Now, I'm not suggesting that tackling stigma or talking therapy isn't helping. It definitely is. But what I am strongly saying here is that it is not the sole solution, even though it's the sole focus of so many mental health organizations. Get people to talk, tackle stigma, get them into talking therapy. But there isn't a scientific basis for that. There's no scientific basis that alone is the solution. And in fact, in 2012, the Samaritans, in an amazing report called Men, Suicide and Society, it's a brilliant report. If you have a spare 30 hours, read it. But if you don't, my key takeaway from that is they literally said that something is not addressing the key factors that generate thoughts about suicide in men, and that something is generic talking therapy. And now we've been through this conversation, like it kind of becomes quite obvious, because generic talking therapy, yes, it has brilliant applications for things like anxiety, for things like PTSD, and other challenges like OCD. But at the same time, it does not tackle these specific factors that are linked to suicide in men. It's not designed to help you achieve recognition, look after your body and mind, protect your cave, have adventures. It's just not designed to do that. And actually, I'm not just going to give you a problem without a solution. In 2020, the Samaritans issued another study, and this time what they've done is something that no one really does. Rather than telling men what to do, you've just got to talk, they actually sat down with men and they asked them. They sat down with depressed men and men who are having thoughts about suicide, and they said, what would help you? What do you need? And these men reported they wanted 3 things. The 3 things was, number 1, to feel that what they did was making a contribution. They wanted to feel their actions mattered. Number 2, they wanted to feel like part of a team. And number 3, they wanted to work towards shared objectives and not just their own. And when I hear those 3 things, I think they're actually the same thing. It's a sense of purpose. And that's what able to serve is. Able to serve is take your current skills, take the time that you have, take your energy, and actually dedicate some of it to the people you care about and the causes you believe in. And don't do it to achieve recognition. Don't do it for the money. Don't do it for the reward. Don't do it for the thank you. Just do it to do it, and realize that you make a really positive difference in this world. And that's able to serve.
I love that. It's absolutely brilliant. I don't know if you've looked into any of the work on longevity and blue zones. There's 5 blue zones in the world, and all of them have this sense of purpose, this sense of community. I think in Okinawa, the Japanese one, they call is incredibly powerful for everyone. So love that was the final one.
And there's kind of a takeaway from all this that I wouldn't share on a normal podcast, but like, you're very clued up, your listeners are very clued up, and I think it's pretty safe to share this. But there's a theory that underpins all this. Like, I want to say where this is leading, what my vision is, like how this framework can be used. But I think it's also really important to say that there's a big difference that's not been spoken about at the moment, which is the way our body creates and transports and uses hormones. That's your endocrine system, right? There's two very different endocrine systems, one found in men and one found in women, or more accurately, male and female endocrine systems. A female endocrine system produces life-affirming psychoprotective hormones like clockwork until roughly menopause. But its job is to keep women happy and healthy. A male endocrine system does not do that job. A male endocrine system is constantly monitoring our performance and our lifestyle. And so in men, we have this situation where as we achieve recognition, as our social status changes, our serotonin fluctuates, women are isolated, they're insulated against that. There's also loads of instances where as we achieve and as we win, our testosterone fluctuates wildly as well, which that's a whole other conversation, but one of my favorites to have as well. Women are completely insulated against that kind of winning and losing in the same way. And women are insulated against the feeling of feeling like a burden in the, when debt goes up and incomes come down for women, the rates of suicide don't really change, but they change massively for men.
Yeah.
And so this theory that underpins everything is that we need to realize that a male endocrine system is constantly measuring you to work out whether or not you should be protected or whether you should be shut down. And it has a lot of tools to shut you down, from poor mental health to heart problems to cancer. The way that it measures your success is testosterone. That is one of the main ways, serotonin as well, and other factors. And actually that's because we come from this period like 8,000 years ago where so few men breeded. You had to get just one. And what did the other 16 men do that didn't pass on their genes? Did they sit around taking up resources? I don't know. But all the science says that when you don't achieve what you want in life, you if you're male, you have thoughts about suicide. And actually now we live in a time where the resources are more abundant, where every man can balance these 5 things in the Alpha framework. And if you balance those 5 dimensions, then your body will take that as a sign that you are an important man, because you are, and it will fight to keep you alive.
Love it, Ryan. Absolutely fascinating conversation. A lot of the things, again, if we would talk about kind of our Paleolithic ancestors and think about the things that are important, well, exercise was very, very different. We were active every day. We weren't sitting at computers, as you say, tapping away. All food was natural. There was no such thing as processed sugars and factories churning out, stuff wrapped in plastic. Sleep was integral, so you had your energy for the next day to go and hunt and do all these things. So I guess that whole aspect of our physical and mental health was just normal back then. But we live in a very different world now. But absolutely loved it. How do people contact you if they've listened to this and everything you're talking about resonates and they think, I really want to work with Ryan? Where do they find you?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. Thank you, Ross. So the way to reach out with me is themenscoach.co.uk. And my mission is to share the science of male mental health. And I do that in talks. I do that in workshops, whether for corporations or organizations like the police force I mentioned. And I also have a 90-day coaching program as well, which is all about closing the gap between who you are now and the man that you were born to be. It's called the Future Self program.
That's super powerful, and hopefully you get lots of new people contacting you after today. I'm sure we could talk forever though. We'll definitely have to get you back on again in the future, but I shall leave you to it, and we'll make sure we have those links on this when it goes out in a couple of weeks.
I would love that. Thank you so much, Ross.
Take care, Ryan. Bye.
Bye.